To recover from COVID-19 pandemic, countries around the world have to set aside a large amount of budget to fight economic recovery. But EU member countries have proposed new direction of sustainable development and raising concern on environment. Netherlands is one of the countries moving toward this direction. What can Thailand learn from Netherlands' experience? Thai PBS World Tonight has more details.
We also have to realize that the fact that we're all focusing on COVID-19 does not mean that other crises have disappeared. No, they're still with us. And today is very much about a crisis that was making the headlines before the COVID pandemic started, and that undoubtedly will come back to the headlines once it's over, and that's of course the climate crisis. Looking at what happened for the last couple of months might make you optimistic, because we see the levels of PM 2.5 going down. We see the CO2 emissions, they went down by up to 8%. So of course one could say, well, you know, it's going in the right direction. But of course we all know that this is not structural, this is purely conjunctural. And once the economies will restart, and they will restart one day, everything, all these figures will go up again. But if we look at the longer term trend, if we take a bit of a distance from the actuality of today and tomorrow, but we look at more the long term developments, a few facts. First of all, mid-January, the 2020 Global Risks Report, that's a report published annually by the World Economic Forum and expressing the opinion of 750 global leaders, private sector, public sector, and so on. It ranked the top 5 global risks as perceived by these 750 top leaders, were all 5, the global risks for the next decade, were all climate and environmentally related. So for these people who are really kind of all having all kinds of leading positions, environment, climate is really, really very central in the decades ahead. A few figures. End of January, Antarctica experienced its first ever heat wave, with temperatures above 0 degrees for 3 consecutive days and nights. Never seen before. 20th of June, Siberian city of Verkhoyansk registered a temperature of 38 degrees. Siberian city. Again, never seen before. Summer of 2019 was the hottest ever in Europe. And in the Netherlands, we had a record degree of 40.7 degrees in the Netherlands. Never seen before. So these are just a few figures, and I could be much longer, to say that, well, although the climate crisis perhaps disappeared from the headlines, it certainly not disappeared from our planet. Now, linking the immediate crisis of COVID-19 with the much more longer-term crisis of climate change, we're seeing now that trillions of dollars are being set aside to support our economies, unseen before. And of course, if we would be able to link these two crises, that would be an unprecedented opportunity to do something about the worsening climate crisis. If I may quote Erik Wiebes, the Dutch Minister for Economic Affairs and Climate Policy, and 16 of his EU colleagues gave out a statement, and now I quote, "We should withstand the temptation of short-term solutions in response to the present crisis that risk locking the EU in a fossil fuel economy for the decades to come," end quote. And again, many others have expressed these kind of views, and I'm sure Pirkka will say a bit more about that later on. And what is the reasoning of linking these packages with the climate crisis? Well, it's of course because these packages, after all, are financed by public funds. So they are generated by the taxes you are all paying. So in that sense, it seems quite justifiable to include sustainability elements or public elements into these support packages. And just to give an example, which is kind of telling, I think, is discussion in many countries about support to airlines. I mean, isn't it fair that when we all support airlines, we also attach some sustainability considerations to these packages? For example, what in Europe is a discussion now, that airlines only get support if they eliminate short flights that might as well be done by train. Or they're being asked to you make more use of biofuels. So these kind of considerations are, I think, quite relevant at the moment. And of course, on the issue of how to link these public funds for the COVID crisis with the climate issue, recently the International Energy Agency and the IMF, they published a report, and it will be presented to the COP26. In preparation for this COP26, IEA and IMF have published a report, and their proposal is to set aside $1 trillion for sustainability packages. We're talking about transportation that is more efficient, more renewable energy production, better isolation of the building sector, or improving the efficiency of electricity networks, these kind of measures. So there are examples. And of course you could say $1 trillion, that's a lot of money, but the total packages so far are $9 trillion. So it's not by all countries. So it's not even, well, it's a lot, but it's not even that much. And the impact would be substantial of this $1 trillion, with 9 million jobs created and 4.5 billion tons of CO2 emissions taken out. So in order to do something about global warming, it makes sense to link it, to link the recovery packages, let's say, for climate reasons. But there are also very sound economic reasons to do so. In a recent report published by the University of Oxford, with many economists participating like Joseph Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern, they argue that if you analyze the impact of a dollar spent sustainably compared to the traditional projects that are being supported, there are higher short-term rates of return and increased long-term savings than the normal ones. So in that sense, it's not only for the climate, but it also makes economic sense. And to be honest, analyzing the recovery packages we've seen so far, it's fair to say that it is not exactly going in the right direction. That, for example, the support given to fossil fuel sectors is about 10 times higher than the support given to renewable energy projects. So in that sense, we really have to keep this issue on the agenda. And of course, this debate is important for all of us, but especially, I think, for Thailand and for the Netherlands. In the Global Climate Risk Index 2020, published by German Watch, Thailand was ranked number 8 in countries being most affected by extreme weather events in the last 2 decades. So Thailand really is in a vulnerable position for climate change and extreme weather events. The Netherlands, as you know, 26% of our territory is below sea level, where 60% of our population lies. So that also makes climate change, sea level rise extremely important for us. So in that sense, we're all in this together. We will certainly, with other EU like-minded countries, try to push the EU to a very positive position for the COP26. And I hope that Thailand also will be with us. I'm sure they will be. And also try to make our nationally determined contributions more ambitious than they are now. Concluding, I think experts tell us that we do have a few years left to change our economic models if we want to achieve the 1.5 degrees and keep it below that limit. But not more than a few years, perhaps a decade, but not more.
I sincerely believe that our session today will be beneficial towards the green and sustainable recovery in the wake of the COVID-19. Now, as you all may know, that 2020 is a crucial year for environment, and as we aim to deliver global solutions to climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. Unexpectedly, the COVID-19 outbreak has inevitably delayed many of our 2020 environmental negotiations, including the UN climate negotiation and the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Just like every coin has two sides, ladies and gentlemen, although COVID-19 has resulted in enormous adverse effect on human way of life and the global economy, but it also has positive impacts on our natural resources and environment. In Thailand, it is evident that the level of pollution and the PM 2.5 has significantly declined, while the wildlife and the endangered marine species and on-land species in the tourist attraction area have reappeared during the past few months. The greenhouse gas emissions has also been reduced. It's a pity, though, that this is merely an ad hoc measures, not a structural reversal, as Ambassador mentioned earlier. However, I believe COVID-19 provides a unique opportunity for us all to work together towards a more sustainable world. While the world has been greatly affected by this crisis, we've seen that international community has come together and worked hand in hand to ensure global security in terms of health, economy, food, water, energy, as well as the environment. In this regard, I would like to commend the EU on the EU Green Deal, which is targeting the EU to be the first climate neutral area of the world. Now, in our region, during the 36th ASEAN Summit, which was held virtually on the 26th of June earlier, concluded on the ASEAN's way to recover from the aspect of the COVID-19. A conceptual note on ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework is expected to be endorsed at the ASEAN Summit by the end of this year. Plastic, big issue. Thailand has implemented a roadmap on plastic waste management 2018 to 2030, aiming to create a circular economy, reducing single-use plastic in a stepwise approach, and replacing it with more environmentally friendly materials. Our ambiguous goal include banning of the capsule, which has already been banned, and phasing out less than 36 microns thick of the plastic bags, or those where you can walk into the convenience stores and just conveniently throw them away. We try to ban those. Plastic cups, plastic straws, we try to ban those by 2022, and 100% recycling of all our plastic waste by 2027. It was calculated that reducing the volume of plastic by 780 million tons per year would contribute to the reduction in the greenhouse gas emission by 1.2 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Now, since the 1st of January this year, our ministry have in collaboration with modern trade of more than 90 companies and retailers, has launched a campaign of everyday say no to plastic bags nationwide. I believe that everybody most of us have seen or have experienced our campaign, especially when you've gone shopping, department stores, convenience store, etc., etc. And would you believe that since October 2019, all of us here in Thailand, we've reduced more than 25 billion plastic bags. We also have a bright side to that. The amount of plastic or marine debris that's been dumping into the ocean has dropped significantly. Since October last year, Thailand was ranked number 6 of being the country that has been dumping marine debris into the ocean. Ranked 6 in the world, but now we're ranked number 10. So because of all these COVID situation, despite the fact that the plastic waste has gone up significantly, it has been concentrated in the household areas. The amount of plastic or waste of debris that's been dished into the rivers and canals that eventually ends up in the ocean has dropped significantly. So that was the upside. Climate change, as one of the key challenges, has been addressed at the highest policy level in our national strategy 2018 to 2037 to ensure inclusive and long-term sustainability. To sustainably recover from COVID-19, we intend to build back better with a green economy that promotes climate resilient society through several activities, including and encouraging SMEs and private sectors to develop green innovation in energy sectors and promoting e-transportation using electric vehicle or EV. It has been further encouraged by overcoming limitation on charging station and EV technologies. Thailand, we have so many laws and regulations about the charging stations, so we are trying to overcome those legal boundaries. And I myself is a big fan of EV, and hopefully the National Committee on EV chaired by the Prime Minister will be an important factor and a driving force behind this issue, and I'm confident, actually I know, that EV will significantly reduce the amount of greenhouse gas in Thailand and global. And I very much hope that I will be able to drive a fully electric car. Well, my wife told me that it will be delivered next month, actually. Just keep my fingers crossed that I can find a charging station around the city. COVID-19 may have been a big catastrophe, globally. It is like Mother Nature is knocking on our door, that we have been messing with her home for decades, for generations. We have upset the balance of the nature. We've been, eating animals. We've been eating bats. I'm not sure if they're trying to be a Batman or what, but it's something that humans shouldn't do. And it is time, ladies and gentlemen, that we really should come together and do something about it. So somehow, along the way, from now on, we will have to make sure that the people in this world, human being, our human race, realize that if we don't do something about our environment now, our nature, our natural resources now, we will not survive. We will not prevail.
So for the first time today, we discuss on after the COVID-19, many countries put up on stimulus recovery packages. But interestingly, in the Netherlands, you put priority on green recovery package. Can you elaborate that a bit more on how you move that forward?
Well, to start, it's very much a work in progress. You know, all this COVID crisis started a few months ago, and I think all governments in the world, including the Netherlands, the EU, Thailand, we all have agreed internally on recovery packages because of the incredible impact on humans, human beings, and on the economy, and especially on the economy. For human beings, of course, it's a matter of, let's say, handing out money to people who really need it. So that's pretty technical. But if you look at the economic recovery, of course, you can make choices in terms of how you spend this money. And we believe that since we're talking about public funds, because these funds are financed by governments, by central banks and so on, and that is basically coming from taxpayers. So we think it makes sense to look at let's say also at more at sustainability dimensions of these recovery packages. But again, you know, this was all decided a few weeks ago, literally. So we're still very much in the progress of designing the package. And also in the Netherlands, it's not like now we have already entirely designed our package. But the discussion we're having is that we realize, my government realizes that yes, we have to support the economy. Yes, it has to have an impact in the short term because people need money now, small, medium-sized businesses, all kinds of economic sectors. At the same time, we have another crisis, which was very much headlines before COVID-19, which of course is the climate crisis. And the climate has been impacted positively by the fact that the economies went a little bit down. But of course that is not structural, that is purely, well, hopefully a very short moment because the economies will go up again. So we have to realize that this climate crisis is still with us. And if you look at developments in many parts of the world, you see that it is still getting warmer everywhere, ice is melting, glaciers are disappearing. We really have to do something. And this is something that, like a crisis like COVID, hopefully once a vaccine is there, it will kind of disappear or be manageable. Climate is of such a magnitude, yet we really have to put it central in everything that we do. So coming back to the recovery package, we realize, because we're talking about incredible amounts of funding, all countries together in the world so far have set aside $9 trillion. These are incredible amounts of money. So instead of just disbursing them without really thinking about the long term, I think my government, European Union, is very much aware that while supporting the economy, we always have to think about the longer term impact. What does it mean? It means that instead of supporting, for example, fossil fuel investments, or building roads the way we did, it is much better to invest in, for example, renewable energy, or make buildings in, of course you don't have that here, but we have, of course, we have winters. So to isolate buildings ultimately will mean less use of energy, which means less CO2 emissions. So by making the economic structure, the infrastructure of the Netherlands, looking at renewable energy, by putting our money into these kind of projects instead of the old-fashioned way, I think makes a lot of sense in view of the climate crisis. And additionally, and there are many reports about this, that you can also see that if you invest in renewable energy instead of fossil fuels, for example, It's good for the climate because there will be less CO2 emissions, but additionally it also makes sense economically, financially, because an investment in these sectors, because for example that the air will be cleaner, which means less people will have health problems, respiratory problems, which means less visits to hospitals and so on. So there are all kinds of other benefits that you can really translate in money. So it also makes sense in terms of in economic and financial terms to invest in renewables instead of in fossil fuels. And in terms of very specific measures, well, the Netherlands, we bet very much on offshore wind because we are a relatively small country which is very densely populated. So it's a bit difficult to have large solar panel parks, for example. Although we do have a lot of solar energy these days on rooftops, but here in the embassy we also have a lot of solar panels on our roof. But we bet more on offshore wind. So in the North Sea we are auctioning large wind farms, as we call them. Some are functioning already, others are being developed. And whenever they will all be on stream, which will take a few more years, that will definitely help our renewable energy, let's say, production. Other things we do, for example, is bicycles. You know, we are a bicycling nation. We have the most dense use of bicycles in the world. And believe it or not, but every Dutch citizen has 1.5 bikes. So every person has more than one bike because people have, for example, if you commute, you have a bike from where you live to the station, you go by train, and when you get there, you have another bike there to go to your work. So these kind of formulas are very popular. So we have a lot of bikes. So part of the recovery funds can also be used to improve bike lanes, you know, to stimulate further the use of bicycles over cars. So there are all kinds of measures, and the last one I'll mention is the EVs, electric vehicles. We really want to make a shift to really go towards EVs. In 2025, it will be almost impossible to buy a normal fuel, diesel or fuel car. It will only be elect EVs. And of course that means also you need a charging station infrastructure. And we have really ambitious plans of really putting charging stations everywhere. And talking about Thailand, I think this is, for example, an area where Bangkok could make incredible progress by having more EV stations in the city. Because, well, we have an electric car at the embassy, a plug-in hybrid, but we charge it here in the compound. We have a charging station, but it's very difficult if you go somewhere to get, you know, to find a parking place with a charging station. And again, these things are relatively easy to do, make the regulation simpler for EVs and for charging stations, having more installed. And ultimately that will create demand and that people will charge or buy more EVs in Thailand, which I think would be very important.
How the Netherlands manage in balancing in terms of quick heal for the economy to the same old economic patterns, but thinking of the greener way. It definitely involves many stakeholders, especially in the government. Some people, for the industrial ministry, will go for their way, or industry will want stakeholder how the Netherlands manages.
No, that's a very, very valid point you make there, that of course every minister or every lobby group has its own way of looking at things, and ultimately you have to agree. But in the Netherlands we have this culture that we call the polder model, which means that we are used, because of our history and having to fight against the sea, you know, we realize we can also only do that if we talk together and if all stakeholders involved agree on the outcome. Only then will we be able to defend our land against the sea. That was when this whole system started. We still do that, and actually we have a climate law in the Netherlands, so the targets we agree in terms of reduction of CO2 emissions and so on are in a law, so let's say which takes it out of the normal political arena where every 4 years you have elections, you have new parties who renegotiate an agreement, but to take it out of that kind of, let's say, short-term perspective, Now our targets are in the law, which again gives it a much stronger position. But to formulate that law, we have had a process where all stakeholders were called together. You talk about the private sector, you talk about consumers, very important, you talk about NGOs, civil society, you talk about scientists, universities played a very important role, and of course the government. And there were we split it up in 6 tables, as we call them. And one table would be infrastructure, another table would be building, a third one would be agriculture, for example. And at every table we would call all the stakeholders to come together, and they were kind of locked in a room and were only allowed to come out by way of speaking after they would have an agreement. We managed, again, it's not an easy process, especially of course if you look at, I don't know, the fossil fuel sector versus the renewable sector. What to get them to achieve a consensus is not easy, but ultimately because I think the awareness about the importance of climate change slowly is really becoming so important all over society, thanks also to the youth. We had, of course, we have Greta Thunberg, which was an inspiration for many young kids across the world. And also in the Netherlands, so there is quite a strong societal pressure to do something about climate, and that helped, let's say, achieve a solution. But it's not easy, and it's work in progress. I mean, we have to continue this discussion, and we're not perfect, certainly not. We have, for example, now a big discussion. We have brand new coal-fired power plants that were opened like 2-3 years ago, and these are billions of euros of investments. And they are relatively clean. For a coal power plant, they are quite clean, much less CO2 emissions than other coal-fired power plants. Having said it, it's still coal. And now there is quite some pressure to get rid of them and to close them down in 2-3 years' time. But that would be a loss of billions of euros of investments. And of course, there are people who say, we can't afford it, we can't do that. Nevertheless, probably we will close them down much earlier than their economic lifespan because of this pressure. And again, it's quite expensive, but again, the pressure is such and the realization we have to do something that probably it will happen.
And lastly, being part of the EU, to promote the Green Deal. But again, within the EU itself, each country affects the COVID-19 in different level, and some country perhaps wants to go to the same old economic patterns. How the Netherlands push forward in this part in terms of budget using for greener options?
Yeah. It's a very difficult discussion, and as you probably know, our heads of government and our prime ministers needed 92 hours of negotiation to agree on the package. But on the other hand, if you look at what was at stake, I mean, it's understandable that it took a long time because you're talking about a package of almost 2 trillion euros. I don't know, in baht that would be times 36. So you're really talking about an incredible amount of money. And of course, everybody's fighting for his or her own position. And the fact that we did reach an agreement, I think, is for all Europeans very important. I think also all Europeans are very happy with the outcome in terms of let's say Europe wants to be the first climate neutral region in the world, which again would be quite an achievement, and I think we are on the right track. Having said it, it was not easy to get to an agreement, and as you said, some countries rely quite heavily on coal, and you cannot force them to, from one day to the other, to close down all their coal plants because, you know, many people depend on the mines, coal is relatively cheap. So what we did as part of that package, there is a fund that has been set up which will compensate those countries that have to make the biggest changes in terms of shifting from fossil fuels to renewables, in terms of supporting them cope with the social impact of this change. I mean, that's very roughly the schedule, and of course that's basically one of the essential pillars of the EU is of course this idea of having one region where some regions support other regions in tough times. And basically the translation in the climate debate is that Europe, through Brussels, through a fund in Brussels, which is, I don't know, it's I think a few tens of billions of euros, that these funds will go to regions particularly hit by the shift from fossil to renewables. But again, this is being done from the perspective that, again, we all realize we just have to change our economic model because of developments in, and again, there are so many examples of global warming and so on. It's really, really worrying, and as all experts tell us, we might have 5 to 10 years to really change the way we operate economically. Otherwise, it's just too late, and nobody wants to know what will happen then.
And lastly, what's perhaps the lesson learned for Thailand that we are not yet start for a greener long-term energy or greener deals? What the lesson learned can Thailand take in from this?
We're in this together. And it is not like if one country does something and another country does something that we will move forward. We need each other. We need to share know-how. We need to share our experiences. As far as Thailand is concerned, of course, you have always two dimensions in this debate. One is we all emit CO2, and we have to move towards emitting less CO2. Of course, Thailand is not a huge emitter because of the level of its economic development, but then it also should move to more renewable energy. We can assist with that. We have all kind of know-how, and as I said, the Netherlands is very much looking at offshore wind. I don't know if for time that's an interesting option, but there might be some possibilities there. But some other countries are better in solar panels or in saving energy, So that is something that is trying to get a greener economy. But the other side of the climate issue is, of course, that no matter what we all do, the climate will change. There will be an impact because there is so much CO2 in the air already. And before that will disappear, it will take centuries. So in that sense, there will be an impact. And we also have to prepare ourselves for the impact of higher sea level, more extreme weather events and so on. For Thailand, it means, for example, that Bangkok is at risk of being flooded much more often because of it's a very low-lying city, and it's very vulnerable for sea level rise, which also means that the salt water is going much further inland, which has an impact on agriculture and so on. As far as Netherlands is concerned, one of our specialties is water. Because of our history, and we regained land from the sea. So we have a very sophisticated know-how about dikes, about canals, about pumps, about I don't know what. So that is one knowledge we would very much like to share with Thailand. The other one is smart agriculture, adapting to new circumstances, which means less water. So drought. And again, Thailand unfortunately has a serious drought problem, as you know, although there are floods as well, but certainly drought is an issue, less possibilities for rice cultivation and so on. Well, we have very sophisticated research, for example, in terms of seeds, that seeds that require much less water than other kinds of plants. So that is something where we could also help. And again, stressing again, we are in this together, and we can learn from Thailand. I'm sure Thailand can also offer us some traditions here that could help us again. And that's what we wanted to start today with this event, is to share know-how. And you heard that many countries picked it up. And the European Union and the UN, of course, is a very important player. So we're all in this together, and we really have to help each other. And we are, again, very happy that Minister Varavut was there, and he is very committed. So, as I said, we will certainly back him in his discussions with his colleagues in the cabinet.